Good. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for day 4 of our TSL 2021 Partner Power Summit on protecting biodiversity. Today, we are going to be thinking about measuring biodiversity, and we're going to have a series of scientists today that are going to be speakers for us to share more about the different techniques that they have been using to explore the wonderful world of biodiversity. And for our first session this morning, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Emma Taylor, who's going to be talking to us about satellites and how satellites can help us protect and monitor biodiversity. So Emma is an engineer with over 30 years experience within space, energy and transport sector. She's worked on creating and designing spacecraft shields for satellites and the International Space Station. She's helped protect lives and the environment, working for energy production onshore and offshore. And she's now transport and trained cybersecurity and safety trained specialist engineer. She comes from some teaching experience. Her parents are both teachers, and she loves passing on her knowledge and encouraging everyone to think about and follow their curiosity. And I'm sure today that she's going to spark your interest with her incredible talk on satellites to seaweed. So I'll hand over to Emma. Thank you for joining us, everyone.
Thank you so much, Kirsty and Eva, for the introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're listening from in the world. So I'm just going to share my presentation now and start with my talk on from satellites to seaweed. And here we go, brilliant. So as Kirsty said, I am an engineer, and I have to say that ever since I started thinking about science and engineering and the planet, I was curious, and I always am curious now. And like in the introduction said, encourage your curiosity. And I hope that throughout this whole week and beyond, you'll be able to carry on asking questions and carry on thinking about biodiversity and space. So the talk, from satellites to seaweed. So I first started thinking about science and engineering and sustainability when I was pretty young. According to my parents, I was always asking questions going, why, why? And I'm sure all of you ask your friends and your parents and your family questions. Why does this do this? How does it work like that? And so it wasn't really surprising that like sort of a few years later, about going to university, I found myself working for a satellite manufacturer. And of course, I was full of those why questions. And one day I walked into the manufacturing area where they were making satellites. And there was this huge, great big satellite. I mean, it was the size of a London bus. And I walked around it, looking at it in awe, thinking, this is incredible. It's big. It's got to go into orbit. And it's going to show us what Earth looks like from orbit. And that was really the start of my sustainability journey in my head and then in my professional life, because I started to see how space could support us. And as I worked on space and trains and other types of platforms for transport, and even looking at what happens on the surfaces of other satellites and planets in our solar system, I was always thinking about what it meant for the overall ecosystem. How does everything fit together? So that satellite that I saw aged 18, called Envisat, and it really made an impression on me looking at this great big thing that was going to be launched on a big energetic rocket, go into orbit, and then survive in the harsh environment of space and sending information back down. Everything that it needed for its mission, it needed to take up with it. The fuel, the communications, the energy, it had to be fully self-sufficient and self-reliant. And I realized that like humans go into space and have to be brave, and engineers design things to go into space and they have to think about resilience, and scientists put those missions into space and they have to think about how you can see and how you can send it back down to Earth. It really is everybody working together in a partnership. I got a sense of courage and exploration from that moment. And that really got me thinking more about how we work with space to look at our planet and beyond. So it's part of an international community. Even from the earliest days, space has been an international partnership endeavor. And even from the earliest days, space has been really about preserving our planet, but also exploring. The picture of that satellite there, obviously you recognize Saturn with its rings, that was Cassini-Huygens, and it dropped a probe onto the surface of a moon called Titan, and Cassini orbited Saturn to see how it worked. And this is very much exploring space for all humanity. And I worked on that mission, and it was pretty cool. I mean, in reality, when I was working on it, I wasn't orbiting Saturn. I was just sat at my computer programming away morning, night, and evening and thinking about how this mission was going to work. But it's great to be part of that endeavor. And space itself is something that's done right across the globe. There is something called the United Nations Space Generation Advisory Council, and that's for the next generation space. If you Google that, you'll be able to see how you can get engaged as you go through your education and studies. And there's even something called the International Space University. And with the power of like the internet, wherever you are, you can tap in and see what people are talking about. So space itself is international, and obviously our planet belongs to everybody. Now, I sat there and I thought about this remote satellite 800 kilometers up in orbit at the start of my sort of sustainability in space journey. And I started to realize, because sometimes it takes a while for a penny to drop, that how did that information get from the Earth's surface up to the satellite? And then how did the satellite actually sound out what the Earth was doing? And it got me thinking about what animals do. They send out waves and then they receive the waves. And so you know how bats and sort of dolphins work, and also submarines too. So these satellite antennas are sensing, they're almost like the satellite's fingers to see what's happening at a distance. And it's physical satellites as well, and physical sensing. You look at both the visual and the infrared and the ultraviolet, all depending on the Earth's atmosphere, what signals it will let through. And of course, when you get the signals back, you have to process them. You have to take the raw data to understand it. So what animals do naturally to understand their environment, we've taken that physics and that science and that engineering, and we learn from what they do and applying it to observing the Earth from space. Now, it's not super easy to build a satellite because they have to be resilient, and it's not super easy to get it into orbit. I mean, launch is stressful in that kind of physics sense of stress for the satellites and for the astronauts too. And you have to get the mass off the surface of the Earth. And like you might think you know about G acceleration, that picture there is the G experienced by systems, one particular system when it's launched into orbit. And you can see 0G and you can see up to 6G spikes. It's extraordinary the amount of physical and vibration and disturbance. So gravity is our friend because it keeps our feet fixed on the ground, but gravity also limits what you can see from orbit, and it also limits what you can get up there, and it limits how you can put people up. There were some early rocket designs that just literally generated too much vibration for the human beings to survive into orbit. So space is great. Space allows us to put these platforms up, but space is also hard to get to. And engineering is good, but you can't get past gravity. So that satellite was called EnviSat. And I like to think of it as my first satellite. Even though I only really saw it in the manufacturing area, I didn't work on the data processing or anything like that. But I had a sense of sort of familiarity. And I hope that as you're going through this talk and afterwards, you can start to think what your first satellite might be, because you too can follow a satellite, understand about its instruments. And now a lot of the data that's generated, it's freely available. So the EnviSat data is available too. And the things that it measured are so important for understanding about how the Earth works. Everything from water vapor to the sea surface, and both in the visible and the infrared, I talked about the different spectrums there. Those trace gases, the greenhouse gases. And also, if you think about it, the Earth reflects the sun, and like the atmosphere also, and that balance of energy coming in and energy being reflected out all helps to balance the climate and the ecosystem. It's all in equilibrium, we hope, and in balance. And did you realize that actually the Earth isn't round? It's more of a shape, a bit like a fat bottomed pear. And that was not my word, but the word of one of my lecturers. And because it's the shape of the Earth isn't round, then the gravity field isn't round. And so actually the ocean surface changes just a little bit. And so you can have a look at like obviously the sea ice and the land heights, but also the topography of the shape of the ocean. Now, you might think it's a long way away, that satellite. How on earth can you know what's going on? But using the different types of signals, you can actually pick out changes in those heights with less than a millimeter. It really is amazing. And of course, the satellite needs to know where it is itself. Otherwise, it can't process the signals. But even back then, which is quite a few years ago now, that satellite could pix itself within 10 centimeters. So this was my first satellite. I followed it through in the first 5, 10 years of my space career, and I just thought it was cool. What you can do with space to see the Earth. But one day, there was a loss of signal from that satellite. It made it through all the way through to 2012, but that was the last signal. And it was a radar image of some islands it sent back. They tried to restart that satellite, but they couldn't. And that was it. It was in orbit, and it was now a dead satellite. And if there's nothing else, that's such a strong reminder of how difficult it is to get up into space and how harsh the environment's there. But it was just one of many satellites. And we'll talk some more about the space environment towards the next part of this talk. So it opened my eyes, and like you could look at the Earth, not just in optical, but also in radar signals. And different frequencies give different information. And that's one of the powers of looking at biodiversity from space to understand how the whole ecosystem. You can look at different layers of information, you can look at the surface, and you can sort of peer through to the ground underneath. And that's important if you want to be able to sound out what the shape of the ground is underneath all the vegetation in a deep forest region, for example. That curiosity, it's almost unbounded. You can look across different frequencies and you can process the data. And that satellite, Envisat, what it did was brilliant, but it's been superseded now by much more advanced signal processing. So radar is one of the tools. So you have optical, you see what you see, but you also have radar. And the radar, the way the signal is reflected back, gives you information about the type of surface that you're looking at, whether it's rough surface, trees, or buildings. And I'm going to make sure that Kirsty and Eva have got some links. There's some great web pages, and space is a global endeavor, but like the one I'm looking at here came from a NASA one, where you can understand a little bit more about the types of sending signal out and reflecting back and how it works and how it lets you see through different things. And so the radar has got names. And so you might see an instrument when you're looking at your favorite satellite that it says X band or C band or L band or P band. And I could never remember what they were. I knew they were different frequencies, but they were neat picture. That gives you the size of the waves. 3 centimeters, 6 centimeters, 24 centimeters, and 65 centimeters. And that tells you and it shows you how far you can see through. Now, all of you are deeply interested in biodiversity and sustainability. And you can see here that by looking at different frequencies, you can see into different parts of a tree structure. And so you can see in different levels how the vegetation is growing. And this is just the smallest snapshot in this talk of all the amazing things that can be done. Also sounding the atmosphere, and this is one is from 30,000 feet, this picture, not very high up in terms of space. But when you sound the stratosphere from space, you can start to have a look at the trace gases that are so important for the equilibrium of the environment and so important for tracking things such as ozone, water, and how it all mixes together and the changes. Space was one of the earliest ways that we could see the ozone hole developing, and space was one of the earliest drivers for realizing we needed to check and think carefully about what we were putting into our atmosphere. The overall atmosphere profile, temperature and pressure, and how much there is, and how much it changes with like sort of distance from the Earth's surface. All of that is information about how our atmosphere is working together. It's a very complex, interconnected system, but it's also sensitive to changes. Now, space is great, and space you can see right down to certain details. But sometimes, if you want to understand what's happening, like for example, in migration routes, you also need to combine it with visual observations from the ground. And there we are, as just an example of one migration route for grey whales and like where the observation posts are. And if you sort of think about they track and they observe, and then start to think about how the environment might affect their migration routes, how the temperature of the sea might affect their migration routes, all of that would change. So you'd pick it up on the ground and start to look back from space to try and understand what's happening. Data from wherever it comes across the globe and from whatever altitude on the ground or up in space can all be combined to give greater insights. One of the amazing things, I think, is just the absolute beauty of those images. I think if you were looking for screensavers for your computer or something from your iPad or something from your phone or something that you can sort of point to your parents, the amazing images that you can get from the West Siberia plain. And this is great because I've got an animation running here and I had no idea there was an animation running, but I will just carry on while the changes come through. The West Siberian plain is a very large, it's one of the largest flatlands in all of the planet. And it's got lots of different biomes, including the tundra. And you may have seen about news reports about how the temperatures are increasing in these northern regions and how that is actually releasing because it's melting the permafrost and releasing gases into the atmosphere. We often worry about the Amazon and the changes in the Amazon coverage and its ability to absorb from the atmosphere and keep the Earth's ecosystem in equilibrium. The Siberian tundra is just as important for its different functions and activities. So I did start my talk with calling it Satellites to Seaweed. And so here's a little bit about seaweed. Now, I have to confess, I really didn't know much about seaweed. And when I was thinking about writing this talk, and I was researching, and I thought to myself, this is amazing. Because you see sometimes in the news media that these got these big amounts of seaweed. They worry about the equilibrium, the changes in temperature of the ocean and how it creates. And this is one of the biggest seaweed blooms, Sargassum, a type of seaweed. It's an algae based. And this huge stretch, it was more than 5,000 miles long. And you can see at the bottom, the scale is like kilograms per meter squared. So it gives you an idea of just how much Sargassum that was there. And it reached and reached. Now, if you were not able to see that from space, you would know locally that you've got a problem, but you wouldn't see the overall extent and you wouldn't be able to model the overall system. So this is a real power of space observation to help with understanding the whole ecosystem. Now, it happens to be that it actually cost just one of the countries involved a huge amount of money to kind of clean up all this excess seaweed. And you could imagine how all of this seaweed would affect the other animals that were living in the sea around it. And here's an example. That was part of like what washed up on the beach and what had to be cleared up. I mean, it's quite shocking when you look at that amount now. So, I mean, seaweed is a sustainable source of food, but seaweed in this case, it's bad. It's had a negative impact, but all of it belongs to us on this planet and the planet, and we belong to the planet too. It's our seaweed. So we have to think about when we're looking to try and develop economy around seaweed, you're going to harvest the ocean. We have to think about it. It is renewable, but it does actually have a function. It does help with storage of carbon across, and it does help with biodiversity. So we have to think carefully. It's not just a resource to be exploited freely without any thought about how we affect the other systems and animals around us, and like plants and algae. It's all life from large to small. And when I was looking at the researching the sargassum and like just being amazed at how big it was, more than 8,000 kilometers across, and I was reading what the scientists were saying, and this is a quote, and they said, the ocean's chemistry must have changed in order for the blooms to get so out of hand. Now, because it's complex, I don't think they had an easy answer to say, well, last Tuesday, then the temperature went up by 0.01 degrees and then the composition changed by this. It's not an easy cause and effect. It's complex and it changes with time. But then you look back and you can see the evidence in front of you that even if lots of small changes have combined, they've created a change in the ocean's chemistry. It's a warning sign. I talked to you about sort of exploiting seaweed and harvesting seaweed. And here are some shots. They're the South Korean seaweed farms. And you can see from above how it works. And there's also farming for other animals as well in the sea, such as fish, both wild and then fish farms too. It's only when you see it from space that you can see the overall impact there. And perhaps analyzing it, I don't have pictures here, you can actually analyze at different frequencies and look at the human impact of the seaweed on the systems and the human impact of the farming as well. Are we using any chemicals that are having a negative impact? continuous observation is so powerful. It keeps us keeping an eye on what we're doing to the planet around us. Now, I have to confess that, like, I don't have absolute direct proof that real astronauts in orbit have eaten seaweed. I found lots of evidence that they're considering algae as a food source for research, for like the long trips to Mars and then even longer trips to anywhere else in the solar system, because you have to have ways of generating food that's deep and nutritious and also can be grown. But I did think it was quite neat. There was a company that was super excited that, like, they developed these seaweed snacks, and what the seaweed snacks were done, they were eaten by space explorers. And this maybe you've heard of this, maybe you haven't, but what they do now sometimes to test whether systems are going to be suitable for these long stays is they actually do ground-based experiments. They put people in like a closed system, they shut the door, and then they leave them there, obviously with enough food and oxygen and systems, to see how they get on for 1 month, 2 months, up to a year. And it was those in like lunar simulator or space simulator type environments that they ate seaweed snacks. And I was searching last night saying, I really want a photo of someone on the International Space Station eating a piece of seaweed, but I couldn't. But they've tried it out in the Earth experiments. And I don't have direct quotes, but they were quite clear in that company that makes those seaweed snacks that, like, they were used. So that's, I think, is a nice little story, because astronauts have to eat. We all have to eat. And, you know, thinking about the sustainability of what we eat is good too. So we're working in partnership, like as part of this fantastic week of events. It really is great. When we connect, we can take a view on sustainability. And this is what, so the UN Sustainable Development Goals are so powerful, because they get everyone to think wherever they are, whatever language, whatever sort of point in society, whatever they're doing around them, they can all cluster around the same goals. And satellites also work together as a team. Different satellites have got different functions, and they can be in similar orbits and cover the same areas and use those different frequencies to extract different information. The power now is, well, it's not infinitely greater, because then everyone's going like, we can't have infinity here, but it's orders of magnitude greater, because you can combine the data sets and add these new analysis things. And we are just turning up the spotlight and turning up our understanding of the Earth systems, you know, year by year. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, I mean, that's all very good. Like Emma's mentioned NASA, and there are other major sort of spacefaring nations too. We know about like China and India and Russia, and there's a European Space Agency. But there's many more countries globally that have got their own space missions up. Those are that's the light green colors, and even more that are developing their own space missions. That's the sort of peachy type colors. And even if your country that you're in right now doesn't have its own space mission, remember I showed that the data is freely available to all to download. So it's quite incredible. I looked at the stats. More than 40 countries and almost 9,000 satellites have been sort of put into orbit. This information is available globally, and more countries are getting involved. And I bet that even the countries that haven't yet launched their own satellite are sharing that information from others. It's not infinitely perfect. We all have bandwidth issues, particularly in this pandemic times. You know, you can only get so much data from A to B, but countries are working together. And so I was searching. I was finishing writing this talk last night, and I was just full of enthusiasm. I'm searching away, and I'm remembering back to those early days of like that first mission when we didn't have. This is going to make me sound really old. I got my first email address when I was at university in 1993. So that gives you an idea of like what like data transmission was. And we used to write our research on small disks, floppy disks. So things has got a lot more modern and advanced now. And that means that now we can pass more data around, and organizations such as NASA and the European Space Agency and lots of others can make all their information freely available. Now, I think all the teachers are thinking, brilliant, excellent, great, I can go and use this data. I have actually given links to Kirsty for schools type links. This is for like anybody. So I think if you click on it, you might find yourself doing sort of images just like real people who are working in their day job as scientists. But if you can log on, create an account and download the data and start to explore, why not? And if you're having technical issues with that, maybe it's a bit too advanced on the programming, there are also resources available for schools as well. But I just think that's great. Free information, free research. And that's just a shot there on one view on the Earth. You could go to that link and scroll around and go all around the Earth as well. And Sentinel is one of the latest missions. And I've got a picture of Sentinel later, and it's one of those networks of satellites I talked about. So it's all connected. So you've got a suite of Sentinel satellites on the right. They're European Space Agency ones, and they use different frequencies and have different types of instruments, and they work together. And you can use that to sound out what's happening with the trees and how that's impacting the polar bear environment, and also the bottlenose dolphins, which are dependent on the ecosystem in the sea. And I have to say that when I put that picture in, I had the face of the dolphin, but then it all got rearranged. So you're just looking at the back fins of the dolphin. But trust me, the dolphin's there. It's just swimming out of shot. But it is all connected. And the thing about space is it helps us see that connection really clearly. Now, I talked about how space is a hostile and difficult environment and how that satellite Envisat, stopped communicating signals. And they're still not quite sure. I think they've got a pretty good idea of what might have gone wrong. But, you can't go up there. Remember how hard it is to launch and pop in and have a look at the satellite. It's up there 800 kilometers up. So you can only really guess. So it's not a natural environment for engineering. It's not an easy environment for people or for machines or systems. The International Space Station's got shields. But that hasn't stopped us exploring to see. And this is a tardigrade. And I love this picture. Apparently, this tardigrade is currently happily hanging out with its moss here. But tardigrades have also been put into orbit, exposed to that harsh environment of outer space. So there's no atmosphere. There's all of those frequencies of X-rays and UVs, which are not being blocked by the atmosphere because you're outside the atmosphere. And these tardigrades were exposed and they were brought back down, and they were able to be rehydrated and regenerated. Obviously not perfectly, but it is an experiment. And these tardigrades can cope with very hot and very cold. And if you're going to research one type of life, you could follow a tardigrade and read up and just think, wow, isn't life amazing? But it does make you think also that if life is so resilient like this, that when you're going from the Earth's surface to explore the moon or to other planets, you've got to make sure that you don't bring any of that life with you because you don't want to pollute the other surfaces of other planets. It's about preserving the rest of the solar system. And when they were starting to think about the first missions to Mars, they were really worried about this risk of importing resilient life from Earth onto the surface of Mars and its planetary protection. And it still holds now that when you're designing something which is going to go to the surface of another planet, you're very careful about it. And then when they started to think about bringing things back from other sort of asteroids or comets or other things back to Earth, you don't want to import. Who knows what's out there in the rest of the solar system? There might be, just as were in the early stages of Earth's development, the building blocks for life. I don't think there's a little green man hanging out on the asteroid waving to us saying, hello, come and give me a ride back on your probe and I'll come and visit the surface of Earth. I think it's more at the building blocks of life, the chemicals. But you want to make sure that when you bring things back down to Earth, you're not importing any different elements, or if you are, at least to be aware of what it is. So the conditions for life can be found perhaps in many different places around the universe. We've not identified them for sure, but we're definitely looking. So space to look down at Earth, but also space to look beyond our own planet and into the solar system and beyond. So perhaps, as I'm coming up towards the end of the talk, perhaps this is something that we can start to think about also, the biodiversity of the future. Now, Venus is not a natural place where you might find life. It's super hot, super high pressure, but you can actually sort of sound out, and this is like a sort of satellite concept. They're developing missions to Venus now and using those radar type signals to cut through the clouds. And given that life can form in some pretty harsh places, can we absolutely say for no that there aren't potential building blocks for life on other planetary surfaces? It's that always curiosity that we all have, and then people are asking themselves questions. No harm in asking a question. Now we know on Earth that, like, subsea volcanoes are home for different types of bacteria that can live of I don't know, like, is it sulfides, some pretty nasty chemicals that you wouldn't want to be eating or breathing, that's for sure. And so as we started to explore other sort of moons in the solar system and sounding through that atmosphere in the same way as you do on Earth, we could see these ice volcanoes. And ice volcanoes potentially could be homes for sort of future. So it's incredible when you look through the atmosphere what you can see about the surface of any object in the solar system. You just need a satellite to be orbiting around. So what is the future for space and for sustainability? How can we carry on use the fantastic resources of being in orbit that gives us, but how can we actually get over the deep challenges of actually getting it up off the ground and keep doing novel designs? So this is where it starts to get very interesting. 3D printing. The top picture is a picture of a titanium ball that's been built through 3D printing, and it's able to do much more complex structures than you'll be able to do just by machining. It allows you to start to think of lightweight, strong structures with complex configurations. And you can actually also start to look at 3D printing in space as well. And it's so exciting that I put 3D printing in space twice on my slides. What I also meant to say, the bottom picture, and this is a company in Scotland, bottom picture, you can do 3D printing to help build rocket engines as well. So there's a lot of change happening. And once you be able to 3D print in space on the surface of other planets or moons, then you don't have to worry about launching a structure. You can launch something at the building blocks and build something that would be so big that it wouldn't fit in the rocket fairing. There's a lot of future and flexibility there. But we do need to think about space as a valuable resource. And as we launch these more and more of these satellites, people are getting more and more concerned. And this is one of the early stages of my research on space debris, because I was thinking, you put this thing up, it stays up, it breaks up, and then it can impact other satellites. And the sort of impact velocities are 5, 7, 14 kilometers per second. And just take a moment to think about those numbers, kilometers per second, just how fast these things are going. And then think of kinetic energy, half mv squared. So we need to look after this space orbit. And this is from a research paper that was published in Nature only 2 months ago. And what they've done is they've looked at the altitude here, which is the height above the surface of the Earth, and looked at the density per kilometers cubed of objects. And this is a log scale here. And you can see these purple lines, and these are the mega constellations that are being proposed and being launched at different elevations. And you can see it's an order of magnitude change along that scale. So there's a lot more material being put up back into Earth, and we need to think about protecting that resource. And that's so important. And in fact, the World Economic Forum have just released a sustainability rating for different missions. If you search for space debris and have a look now, there's so much new stuff that's being done and considered. But just as looking after the Earth's environment itself, there are various challenges and pressures, and it's not an easy problem to solve easily. So we need to make sure that we look after the space resource in order for us to be able to look at the Earth's surface. And we need to get to space more cleanly, but we also need to clean space when we get there. And this is another neat engineering that's happening right now. It's a space debris capture and retrieval mission, and it launched not that long ago, actually. And so the idea is you can go up to a satellite, capture it, and then deorbit it. And you think, well, that's great. I've seen it in the movies, just put a net over it, no problem. But think about those impact speeds. Think about those orbital speeds. Could you put your hand out and catch something going past at 7 kilometers a second? No way. And how would you catch it and impact it without it breaking up even more? Because if something hits something at that speed, you can bet it's not going to be like a twang, twang. It's actually going to break up and fragment. The temperatures and pressures that are generated are enormous. So it's not so easy. So you have to be able to move alongside and use various techniques. And this is something that people who are thinking about sustainability of space are focused more and more on this topic. So as I'm coming up towards the end of my talk, I think I'd like to say that even if we're not directly working in the space industry, we can all be space explorers for sustainability and diversity. We can all start to think about the perspective of the Earth from orbit and the information that you can get and how that increases the knowledge and understanding and how we can use it to inform what we do locally and how we can use it to encourage other people to think about sustainability and biodiversity. So what's next? Hopefully I've made the case and encouraged you to think about the fact that like sustainability and biodiversity can be supported by using space and satellites to help us increase our understanding. And also I've shown you there's so many new revolutions in technology that we can do more and more and more from space orbit. And we can see more and more and analyze more and more. But there are changes, positive and negative in the way we're using space, and there are changes too in the environment. So with your curiosity that you all have, and that with your friends and your family and the communities around you, there's nothing stopping you having a search and asking questions and looking at space images. And if there's a citizen science project that you can sort of do, why not take part if bandwidth and time allows? And why not have a search and look at some of the space missions and pick one that you're going to adopt, and you'll learn about its instruments and follow what it does. And it doesn't need to be the biggest mission. It might be a satellite mission from your country or your neighbor's country, or something that you're particularly interested in because it looks at a certain type of the sea or the ice coverage or whatever. There's so many missions out there. I'm sure there's one that will be interesting for you too. And so I'll wrap up my talk. I am just about 40 minutes dead on time, and I'm ready for the questions and answers.
Amazing. Thank you, Emma. That was such an interesting talk. I'm absolutely fascinated. And I think judging by the questions, everyone else has been as well. Would you like to invite the audience members to send them to ask the questions directly, or do you want to read them out from the chat? I think most of the viewers are with us.
Well, I tell you what, I think I'll let you select the questions for me and read them out, and then I'll answer them. And then if there's an audience member with another question, then we'll do that. So.
Okay, so the first question came through from Ewan, who's with us on Zoom. Thank you, Ewan. And you did sort of answer it in your talk, but he was asking about research into technology that can be used to clear up space debris. So you said that's an area that's really developing at the moment.
I think there's a lot that's happening. In fact, I've got a bit of a spacecraft here. I'll just give you an idea of why it's such not an easy problem. Hang on 2 secs. This is when I'm. So Kirsty didn't know I was going to do this. So this is. Do you remember I talked about Envisat? And like I walked by and I said, I wonder what's going to happen with that, brave satellite explorer. Then what I did was I actually asked them, can I have some bits of it? And they took it back to the gun when I was doing my research and blew some holes in it to see what would happen. And this is really insightful. So this is what the Envisat structure is. It's not actually been into space. It was just a spare bit left over from the manufacturing. So you can see by my hand the kind of scale. Anyway, so this hole there was made by something 4.5 millimeters across. So that hole is bigger. You can tell by the size of my finger there. Anyway, it went straight through and it came out the back. There we are, there's a hole. And it also blew the back off. And that's kind of honeycomb metal. So when you start to think about technologies that can be used to catch, it's not so easy. I mean, I think some of the sort of solutions are thinking about sort of magnets, but a net's not going to work, just go straight through. So it really is making sure that onboard the satellite here has enough fuel to do collision avoidance maneuvers, which is another difficult thing itself, and also then to be able to deorbit if it's a low Earth orbit or get out of orbit if it's in geostationary. But people are putting their attention on it. Possibly something that you want to think about, and people do, is make sure that your satellite is resilient. Because if your satellite's got resilient engineering, communications, propulsion, an ability to move itself out of the way, then you're going to stay in control of the satellite over its whole life. And so that's what people do. They're thinking also about making sure their satellites can withstand the harsh environment. So then you don't have to think about a solution for deorbiting. But some of the things that are up there were designed 30 years ago when people were thinking less about this problem. So hopefully, I haven't really sort of answered saying there's some neat solutions. I'm saying people are working on it, and I've given you an idea of the scale of the problem.
Great, thank you for that, Emma. And a question from Simonette, who's one of our teacher champions, who's watching live on Facebook in Romania. She said, what should humans take to space and what should humans be leaving behind in space?
That's a great question. I think that it's 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 not small. Space is really big, and I know that sounds a bit cliched, but you can take and explore space and leave things behind and not have a direct impact. So humans need to take up to space what they need to survive, and human needs to take up to space what they need to do the experiments. You can't just turn up, without a spacesuit, for example, and you need a space station around you to keep you alive. And you need those missions and those instruments. There's no point going up there without the tools for your job. You don't go off to teach in school without your textbooks, so you don't go out into space without your equipment. So you've got to take up what you need up there. And astronauts and space missions, because every kilo counts, every kilo costs money to get out there, they think really smart and they get the most value from all the mass they put up in orbit. In terms of bringing back down from orbit, what humans can bring back down, often they want to bring the results back down of those experiments. And also they need to recognize that the heat temperatures caused by the re-entry, I mean, all you have to do is look at the sort of in-camera footage from re-entry capsules from the International Space Station just to see how hot it gets on the outside. So unless you bring things back with that protective environment around them, many times it will just burn up in the atmosphere. So tough to get up and tough to bring back down.
Great, thank you, Emma. James Myers, who's with us on Zoom, asks, is there
Hi.
any international agency with a mandate to coordinate the sustainability of space resources like satellites and data from space observation of Earth?
So that is a very on-topic question right now. And so I'll give the answer just as an overview, and I'll bet you like next month it will change. So the United Nations signed something called the Outer Space Act back in the 1960s, which essentially said, let's work together to use space well, and let's have the countries work together to use space well in a sustainable way. And that set out the general principles. How that's kind of been implemented in practice has changed with time. And as more and more countries are launching their rockets, there's a lot of questions going on about whether people should be launching, and are they launching too many or too few, and are they launching them in a safe way? So at a practical level, if you want to go into orbit, you need to have your own communications frequency, because if you can't talk back down to Earth, there's no point having the satellite there. And so there are bodies, national bodies and international bodies, that hand out frequencies, and you have to make an application to them. You can't get your frequency, just drop them an email. You have to make a case that you're going to use it well, they're not going to interfere with anybody else using nearby frequencies and so on. You have to be a responsible user of that frequency. And so that's one way they influence what goes into orbit. Different countries set different protocols. Another way that they influence is by, if you want to launch your rocket, you've got to make sure that your rocket will not interfere with airplanes going by. But remember, the atmosphere is quite big as well, and no aircraft is going to fly next to a rocket site, so it's not something that runs the risk of happening next Tuesday. And also that it's not going to explode on the ground and then sort of harm people, or explode on the sea surface. But again, people, when they're doing rocket launch sites, they don't plant them next to a major city just for that reason, because space is a challenging exploring environment. So each country looks to implement the principles of the Outer Space Act, but different countries have their own approaches to it and a lot of sort of interpretation. So right now it's a hot topic because people are asking about the questions about satellite launches. So you asked also about the mandate for international collaboration around data. Now, because space missions require many countries to collaborate, they obviously then collaborate about the sharing of the data. And when you look at those instruments on that big satellite, like in Envisat, for example, a European one, you'll see different instruments come from different countries. And what they do is they form teams. There's a principal investigator, and they have teams of analysts on the board. So you have all these big satellite engineering and different individual projects on, and then people share the data. I mean, the United Nations does an awful lot of global collaboration. I can't think of the acronym right now to do with global collaboration on sharing of data. But if you have a look at the UN Space Generation Advisory Council, which is where the next generation of people are, that will tell you the latest state of what's happening.
Great, thank you, Emma. Next one, question comes from Carl, who's our TSL director, who's joined us. He said, what do you think about the race to space? Some of the world's most famous billionaires, such as Jeff Bezos, Branson, and Elon Musk. I'm concerned about the ecological footprint of the space race at a time when we're already over-consuming Earth's precious natural resources.
Well, I don't want to comment directly on Bezos or Musk because we'll probably then find them complaining about us talking about them specifically on Twitter. Those are just two of the most high-profile examples of this great broadening and democratizing access to space. 10 or 20 years ago, only a few countries could go into orbit, but now many more can because the launch technologies are developing, satellites are getting smaller, and smaller equals easier to launch. So more access to those valuable resources is a good thing. And engineering can actually help reduce the impact, but there is a kind of call on our planet. And I was talking about this with my husband. He said, what are you going to do if you get asked the question about Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, and how are you going to answer it? And he's probably listening next door going, yep, she's got that question. I think it's a trade-off. I mean, when you think about the technologies that give us power and energy, wind turbines or nuclear power or solar panels, all of those have an ecological impact to create that system. You have to use energy to make structures and things, but they then provide benefit to humanity. And I think that whatever you are, whether you're a billionaire with your own private company or whether you're in a country, it's always sensible to step back and think about the whole holistic impact that you have. And this is where the UN Sustainable Development Goals are great, because whatever you're doing, you just kind of step back and think against those principles. Am I doing all the things that I can do against that aspect? Is there anything else I can do? It's no harm in asking and questioning. So hopefully I've managed to sort of answer that question, not just for famous billionaires, but for everybody.
Great, thank you, Emma. Well trodden. Okay, next up we've got a couple of questions from some of our student viewers. So Anne Vishika, who's watching from India, has said, due to least resources, how can we set up biodiversity or explore biodiversity on other planets like Mars?
I think that this is an incredible question that's going to be looked at over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. If you go and search right now how many missions are either planned for Mars or on the surface of Mars, there's a lot. It's amazing, actually. It's almost like going to the surface of that planet has become, well, it's not easy and it's not normal, but it's practical. People are learning from each other exploration. Are we in a position yet to start thinking about biodiversity on Mars and what it means in practice? I would say not. But people are already starting to think about how you can grow food for deep space missions through to Mars. And obviously, once you start to think about food, then you can think about the ecosystem. And one of the things to think about, actually, the International Space Station right now, it is a closed ecosystem. Not completely closed because it gets its power from the sun and the sun onto the solar panels, and the solar panels make electricity and you get the supply missions. But in the main, it's a closed bubble. So you have to think about the biodiversity and how things are balanced in there as well. You've got to make sure that the air is clean. You've got to handle all the fluids. You've got to make sure there's enough food on board. And when you go to Mars or when you go to other planets, again, you're not going to be wandering around on the surface. You're going to be in those closed systems. So people are thinking about it practically, and people are making neat movies about it as well. So you can have it from the Hollywood perspective or the Bollywood perspective. And I don't even know if Bollywood's done any Mars movies, but maybe they should think about it. So future thinking and practical. People are asking those questions.
Brilliant, thank you, Emma. And Daniel has also sent another question in that somehow links to this one. So do you think we can import living organisms like bacteria or other prokaryotic organisms to another planet and have them survive in its harsh environment? And he also asked, do you think we can discover new renewable energy sources in space?
So going by what happened with the tardigrades, I don't see any reason in principle why an experiment couldn't be done to test the resilience. And I think that it sounds like that's going to be the subject of your next school project, for sure. I would encourage you to follow your curiosity